Good evening, everyone. I want to begin by thanking everyone for joining us, everyone who is joining us for this Matzah HaGadol Drasha. I want to let everybody know that these sources are available in the chat. So the sources that we're making reference to were just posted by Alicia Stein, our executive director. On that note, let me thank her for doing everything she always does and did in particular going into the Shabbos, both this morning at the Gala Kiddush and this evening for Shabbos HaGadol. I'd like to begin by thanking all of our sponsors. Tonight, we thank the sponsorships of Talia and Danny Ackerman, who sponsored in memory of Danny's father, Jeffrey Ackerman Baruch ben Alexander, on his second yahrzeit. We have an anonymous sponsorship, B'schos Refuah Shalema for Shmuel Simcha ben Freda. Thank you to Nechama and Ari Ekman, who sponsored in memory of Ari's father, Lester Ekman, Eliezer Shmuel ben Ari Leib Alav Shalom, on his fourth yahrzeit, which will happen on the seventh day of Pesach of Aleph Nisan. Thank you to Marsha and Mel Ness, who sponsored in memory of Mel's father, Louis Ness, Ari Leib ben Yaakov, his 56th yahrzeit was the 20th of Nisan, as well as Mel's grandmother, Chana Ness, Chana Bas Ari Leib, whose 69th yahrzeit is the 16th of Nisan. Thank you to Susan David Rosenbaum, who sponsored in memory of David's mother, Adel Bas Yoshua. Her yahrzeit is on Erev Pesach. And thank you to Lisa and Ari Sugarman and family in memory of Alan Sugarman, Avram Shmuel ben Yehuda Aryeh Alav Shalom, whose yahrzeit is the 18th of Nisan. May our learning be a merit for Refu'os b'mehera, and may all the neshamos have an aliyah. Our topic for this evening's shir, our title for this evening's shir, is a year of Matzah and Maror. And I think that the symbolic resonance of the title in many ways speaks for itself. But in order to give substance and form to that title, we're going to take a look at a topic that really begins as a story of a man and a verse. The man is not just any man, he is one of the greatest human beings ever to walk this planet, a Jew that we know simply by the name of Hillel. And the verse is not just any verse. We, of course, know that every pasuk in the Torah possesses infinite kedusha, infinite sanctity. But this particular pasuk is actually a centerpiece of our Seder experience in a variety of ways that we will hopefully explore tonight. And my hope is that by exploring this pasuk and by exploring Hillel's interpretation of this pasuk, we will derive a greater understanding, not just of Matzah, not just of Maror, not just of the night of the Seder, but really the entirety of the Pesach holiday, perhaps all of Torah religious life as a whole, and perhaps even life itself. We'll begin with a very familiar passage, a passage that will be familiar to anyone who annually observes the Seder, from a section of the HaGadol that we call Korech. After we have drank the first 2 cups of wine, after we've told the story, after we have eaten matzah, after we've eaten maror, we then take matzah and maror, we join them together, we create a kind of matzah and maror sandwich, and we declare, in the words of source number 1, Zecher lemikdash kehillel. We do this as a commemoration of the times of the Mikdash, like Hillel, like Hillel's practice, and we explicate, Kain asa Hillel bisman shebeis hamikdash hayakayam. This is what Hillel would do when the Beis Hamikdash was standing. Hayakorech Pesach matzah umaror ve'ochel biyachad. He would make this sandwich. He would wrap together Pesach, the carbon Pesach, matzah, and maror. Note that our Haggadah includes the carbon Pesach as part of this sandwich. That is the view of Rashi. As we'll see soon, it's not a universally held view, but he used to wrap everything together, and he would eat it all at once. To fulfill the words of the pasuk, which words? Al matzos umerorim yochluhu. You should eat the carbon Pesach on matzah and maror. That pasuk appears in Bamidbar Parak Tes pasuk Yud Aleph. It appears in source number 2. Note that the context of this pasuk is not the Exodus from Egypt. The pasuk does not appear in Sefer Shemos as we would expect. Instead, it appears in Sefer Bamidbar, Pashas B'Ha'aloscha, in the context of Pesach Sheni. Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu that if for whatever reason someone was not able to bring the carbon Pesach in the proper time on the 15th of Nisan, they were tameh, they were ritually impure, they were defiled, or they were b'derech rechoka, they were on some distant highway, and they weren't able to bring the carbon Pesach in Yerushalayim. In those instances, they wait a month, and then they bring the carbon on the 15th of Iyar, on the holiday that we call Pesach Sheni, And how are they supposed to eat the Karban Pesach? Says the Torah in source number 2, the final 4 words, Al matzos umerorim yochuluhu, you shall eat it on Matzah and Maror. And that is the pasuk from which Hillel derives this charge to eat Matzah and Maror together. That is again what we call korech. Now, the original source for Hillel's interpretation of this pasuk is a Gemara in Pesachim Daf Kuf Tes Vav Amud Aleph that appears in source number 3. For those of you who have the sources, you will see that I kind of artificially divided this Gemara into 5 separate paragraphs. Of course, in the original, there are no paragraph divides in the Gemara. It's all one contiguous passage in the Gemara. But it's an important Gemara for understanding this korech practice of Hillel, and it's one that we will try to analyze together this evening. Now, before we jump into the Gemara, a few pieces of background information to bear in mind. Number 1, as we read the Gemara, keep in mind differences that the Gemara presents between the way the Seder was observed in the times of the Beis HaMikdash versus the way it was observed after the Churban Bayis, after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. If you look back at source number 1, at our text in the HaGadol, we say that the korech is what Hillel did, Bizman sheBeis HaMikdash hayakaya, in the times when the Beis HaMikdash was still standing. And we'll see in a moment that our Gemara will distinguish between what Hillel did in the times of the Beis HaMikdash and what he did after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So keep an eye out for what was done then and what we do now. That's number 1. Second piece of background information. This Gemara will pertain to a concept in halacha that is known as bittul, one taste nullifying or canceling another one. Say you have 2 tastes in your palate at the same time. Say, for example, it is matzah and maror. Can those 2 tastes simultaneously coexist, or does one cancel the other? That is the concept that we know in halacha as bittul. And one of the questions that we will have to assess in the Gemara is whether indeed these 2 tastes cancel each other, whether there is bittul, or whether they somehow transcend the problem of bittul, whether you're able to hold both tastes simultaneously. That's number 2. And number 3, third piece of background information, an important part of this Gemara and a subsequent Gemara that appears 5 daf later, that we will see later tonight, is the status of the mitzvah of Maror. We, of course, eat Maror at our Seder, but what status does Maror have? We are going to see that in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, when a Karban Pesach was brought, Maror was mid'oraisa. It was a biblical level obligation, just like Matzah is. Maror was mid'oraisa, but post Churban Bayis, after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, it was relegated to the level of D'Rabbanan. It went down to a lower level of halachic obligation. It was only rabbinically mandated, rabbinically obligated. It was no longer a biblical obligation in the absence of the Karban Pesach. And that's something that we will also explore further, but something to bear in mind as we approach the Gemara itself. Let's dive into source number 3. The Gemara begins. Amar Ravina. Ravina reports, Amar li Rav Mashashia B'rei Rav Nasan. He says in turn that he heard from Mashashia, the son of Rav Nasan, Hachi Amar Hillel Mishmei de Gemara. Bold of source number 3. This is what I heard from Hillel, who in turn reported that he received this as a transmitted tradition. This was transmitted to Hillel himself. What is the tradition that Hillel received? Lo nikroch inish matzah u'maror b'hadi hadadi v'nechol. One should not mix matzah and maror together and eat it at the same time. Mind you, here Hillel is talking about life after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. After the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, you should not eat them together. Why? Mishum desviralan, because we believe, matzah b'zman hazeh mid'oraisa. Matzah is a biblical obligation. Umaror derabanan. Maror is only a rabbinic obligation. It is a lower level halachic obligation. Ve'asi maror derabanan umevatele lamatzah de'oraisa. The maror, which is a rabbinic obligation, will impede with your ability to fulfill the mitzvah of matzah. Its taste will nullify or cancel the taste of matzah. You won't be able to fulfill the mitzvah mid'oraisa. So, says Hillel, do not eat them together. The Gemara continues after the bold. Even according to the opinion that maintains that mitzvos do not cancel one another, the Gemara qualifies and says, Hani mili de'oraisa b'de'oraisa o de'rabanan b'de'rabanan, abel de'oraisa b'de'rabanan asi de'rabanan u'mavatolei b'de'oraisa. Says the Gemara, there are those who maintain that when 2 mitzvahs are on the same level, they have the same level of halachic obligation, the same level of halachic imperative. They are either both mid'oraisa, they're both biblical, or they're both mid'rabanan, they're both rabbinic. In that circumstance, The mitzvahs can simultaneously coexist, and neither one nullifies or cancels the other. But in a circumstance where you're dealing with mitzvahs on two different levels, one is de'oraisa on that high level, the second is d'Rabbanan, that lower level obligation, then the mitzvah midrabbanan will impede your ability to perform the mitzvah midoraisa. Nowadays, maror, as we just said, is midrabbanan, matzah is midoraisa. Says Hillel, if you try to eat the two of them together after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, you will not properly fulfill your mitzvah of matzah. The maror d'Rabbanan will get in the way. That is the first statement of our Gemara. Second paragraph of source number 3. The Gemara asks, Man Tana d'shamitlaim mitzvos in mevatlo zuazu. Who is this Tana? Who is the one who maintains that mitzvos don't cancel each other when they are on the same level? Who says that? The Gemara answers, Hillel he. It is that very same Hillel. Hillel is the one who maintains that when they are on the same level, they do not cancel one another. How do we know? The Sanya, for we learned in a brisa that will be far more familiar to us. Amru alav al Hillel. They said about Hillel, Shahaya korchan bevas achas, that in the times of the Beis Hamikdash, he would indeed bring everything together into a single sandwich. He would wrap everything together, the ochlan, and he would eat matzah and maror together. Shenemar al matzos umerorim yochluhu. Once again, we have a quotation of this pasuk, Midbar Parates pasuk Yud Aleph, the same pasuk that we quote in the HaGadol. In the times of the Beis Hamikdash, when matzah and maror were on the same level of halachic obligation, Hillel would eat them together in order to fulfill the words of this verse that it should be eaten together with matzah and maror. If we seek to distill these first two paragraphs, what we've essentially said so far is that in the times of the Beis Hamikdash, matzah and maror were on the same level of halachic obligation. Accordingly, Hillel felt that neither of those mitzvahs cancels the other or impedes one's ability to fulfill the other mitzvah. You were able to fulfill them both at the same time, and so Hillel would fulfill them both at the same time. He would wrap them together and eat them. But post-Churban Bayis, post-destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, Maror was relegated to the level of D'Rabbanan, and Hillel says, no longer do we eat them together. They should be eaten separately post-Churban Bayis. Paragraph number 3. Here we encounter those who argue with Hillel, who disagree. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan reports, Cholkin alav chaveira al Hillel. Hillel's rabbinic colleagues did not agree with him. His view was not unanimously agreed upon. There were those who disputed this assertion of Hillel. Tesanya, for we once again learned in a brisa. Perhaps you should wrap everything together, the matzah and the maror, and eat them the way that Hillel used to eat them. Talmud Lomar, the pasuk comes to tell you, al matzos umerorim yochluhu. The same exact pasuk, the same 4 words that Hillel used to tell you that you should eat them together. The Chachamim, the rabbinic colleagues of Hillel, they say, afilu zeh b'fnei atzma v'zeh b'fnei atzma, those words teach you that they can be eaten separately. After paragraph 3, we emerge with a machlokas as to what should be done in the times of the Beis Hamikdash. Hillel says that one should eat them together, and that's what we record in our Haggadah, Zecher l'Mikdash Kehillel. But Hillel's colleagues, the other Tanaim, the Chachamim, the Rabbanan, they maintain that matzah and maror should be eaten separately. That's paragraph number 3. The fourth paragraph of source number 3 is a very important, it is a critical paragraph, but lamentably, it is one that we are going to skip for tonight. It is a remarkably complex paragraph. There are probably 5 or 6 different approaches as to how to understand it in the Rishonim. Our minhag in Bnei Yeshurun has been that twice a year, after Shabbos HaGadol and Shabbos Shuvah, we always offer a follow-up shir to further explore the halachic themes that we discuss in the Drasha. And please God, next Shabbos, or this coming Shabbos, Shabbos Chol HaMoed, we will be doing a deep dive into that paragraph of the Gemara. We'll be looking at it under a much closer lens. But in the interest of time and simplicity for tonight, we will skip that paragraph and move to the final passage of the Gemara. At the very end of source number 3, the Gemara asks, where does this all leave us? We have this dispute between Hillel and the Rabbanan. What do we do? How are we supposed to practice at our Seder? Says the Gemara. Now that we have this machlokas, and the Gemara says we can't really decide who is right in this machlokas. We can't decide which opinion we accept the halacha, which opinion we paskin like. What do? The Gemara goes on to describe precisely what we do at our Seder. Mevarech al achilas matzah ve'achil. You make a bracha of al achilas matzah, and you eat matzah. And then you make a bracha of al achilas maror, and you eat maror. And then you wrap them all together, you have a sandwich, you eat it without a bracha, and the Gemara concludes with those three immortal words, Zecher l'mikdash kehillel, as a commemoration of what Hillel did in the times of the Mikdash. The Gemara says we don't really know what to do, so we try to do both. We try to make sure that we have matzah, and then we have maror, and then we have both of them together, so that we fulfill the opinion of the Chachamim and the opinion of Hillel. We make sure that everyone is accounted for. Now, there are definitely many points of ambiguity in this Gemara, but in the end, the picture that the Gemara paints seems to be clear. We have a machlokas among the Tanaim as to how to properly eat matzah and maror in the times of the Beis HaMikdash. Should they be eaten together or should they be eaten separately? And the Gemara says we don't know how to paskin on that issue, so we conclude that at our Seder, we actually do both. We eat matzah, we eat maror, and then we eat them together as a korech, we are korech, korcham biyachad, we eat them together, zecher l'mikdash kehillel, as a commemoration of Hillel's practice. That's the picture that emerges from the Gemara. The problems begin, as they so often do, when we turn to Shitas HaRambam, when we turn to the opinion of the Rambam. In the 8th chapter of Lechos Chametz Matzah, the Rambam describes what a Seder should look like. And the Rambam describes what a pristine, genuine Seder should look like, by which I mean, he describes what the Seder looked like in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, when there was a Karban Pesach, when we weren't missing the centerpiece of the Seder. The Rambam describes what the Seder should look like, and he makes parenthetical points about ways in which our particular Seder, our Seder after the Korban Bayis, the way the Rambam's own Seder, differs from the Seder that existed in the times of the Beis HaMikdash. And accordingly, he discusses this question of Korech in two separate halachos. He discusses it in Chametz Matzah, Perek Ches Halacha Vav, which we have in source number 4. That's where the Rambam describes how one should eat matzah and maror in the times of the Mikdash. And he again describes it in Chametz Matzah, Perek Ches Halacha Ches. That's when he describes how we eat matzah bisman hazeh. As we read source 4 together, we'll stick to the bold passages of source number 4, again, in the interests of time and simplicity. Those are the prescriptive sections of the Rambam, where he describes what exactly you're supposed to do. The explanations we'll leave for another time. The Rambam describes what exactly one should do, again, in terms of eating matzah in the times of the Beis HaMikdash. As we read this Rambam together, I ask you to read the Rambam through the lens of the Gemara that we just studied together. We saw that there is a machlokas tanaim regarding how to eat matzah and maror. We saw the Gemara's conclusion that we don't know how to paskin. Does the Rambam maintain that conclusion? Does he put his thumb on the scales? Does he paskin between Hillel and the Rabbanan? How does the Rambam understand korech, matzah, maror in light of the discussion that we saw in the Tanaim and the Gemara? Source number 4. The Rambam says you wash a second time, you make a bracha the second time you wash. For the Rambam, you would actually make a bracha the first time you washed as well. As we'll see as we read through this halacha, there were a number of differences between the Rambam Seder and our own, but the Rambam starts with Netilas Yadayim. Second bold passage. You take 2 matzahs, of course we take 3. You break one of them. Of course, again, in our Seder, we already did this earlier. But the Rambam says, take the 2 matzahs, break one of them, and you make the bracha of hamotzi. So we have Netilas Yadayim, we have hamotzi. What comes next? Next bold passage of the Rambam. And immediately then, after you've made the hamotzi, korech matzah umaror ke'echad umetabo b'charoses. You immediately make a sandwich of matzah and maror. Note the Rambam does not include Karban Pesach. He says it is just matzah and maror. But he says you wrap them together, you dip them in the charoses, umevarech, and you make a bracha that we have never made. Be'ez Hashem, we should be zocha to make soon. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvosav b'tzivanu, al achilas matzos umerorin. You make a single bracha on eating both matzah and maror. Ve'ochlan, and you eat them. Now, if we're viewing the Rambam through the lens of our Gemara, it seems clear that the Rambam is indeed taking a stand in this machlokas among the Tanaim. And his stand appears to be clear. He appears to paskin like Hillel. Hillel said the way you eat matzah and maror in the times of the Beis HaMikdash is by wrapping it all together and eating it. And that's exactly what the Rambam says you should do. As the Ravid notes in source number 5, Hasogos Ravid Sham, Achakach Lokeach Matzah Umara B'Tabel Ke'echad, Omer Abraham Zehu Kehillel. He says the Rambam is indeed taking a stance. He quotes the Gemara Psachim Kuf Tesvav, the Gemara we just saw in source number 3. The Rambam holds like Hillel. The Rambam does note in the final line that B'di'eved, if you ate just matzah and just maror, you were yotzei the mitzvah as well. But it is clear that his preference, it seems clear that his preference, is to eat them together like the opinion of Hillel. And this is the first question that troubles many of the commentaries on the Rambam. Why does he abandon the conclusion of the Gemara, which says we don't know who to paskin like Hillel or the Rabbanan, and simply adopt one position, one side? If you look in source number 6, in the Lechem Mishnah's commentary on the Rambam, after the period, he says as follows: Kasha, this psak of the Rambam is difficult. Because we are concerned about both opinions, Hillel and the Chachamim, and the Lechem Mishnah adds, and we will see in a moment in source number 7, the Rambam himself seems concerned for both opinions. He adds, how can the Rambam write that in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, Rotza Osazev and Rotza Osazad, that you could just do one of the two opinions, and particularly the opinion of Hillel, bold of source number 6, the Rambam should have paskin that if indeed we're not sure whose opinion is correct, that you should do both. We do it nowadays. Why was it impossible to do it in the times of the Beis HaMikdash? Says the Lechem Mishnah. The Rambam shouldn't have favored Hillel's opinion over that of Chaveir of the Hillel, over the Rabbanan of Hillel. He should have said, even in the times of the Mikdash, eat matzah, eat maror, and then eat korech as well, just like we do bisman hazeh. The first question that is posed on the Rambam is, why does the Rambam elevate Hillel over the Rabbanan, over the Chachamim? If the Gemara doesn't do so, the Rambam should have been equally concerned for both opinions. That's problem number 1. If problem number 1 pertains to the way the Rambam elevates Hillel, the second problem in the Rambam is the opposite. Because when the Rambam quotes or describes the way we do korech at our Seder, bisman hazeh, after the Churban Bayis, he seems to eliminate Hillel entirely. Source number 7. Bisman hazeh, nowadays, she'ein sham korban. Now, ba'avonoseinu harabim, we no longer have the korban pesach. Achar she'mevarech hamotzi lachem. So after you make hamotzi, you don't go straight to the sandwich. What do you do instead? Chozer umevarech al achilas matzah. You make a bracha of al achilas matzah. V'tovel matzah b'charoses v'ochel. And you dip the matzah in the charoses. That is not something that we do. But the Rambam says you then eat the matzah, and that certainly is familiar. We make the bracha of al achilas matzah, and we eat the matzah. V'chozer umevarech, second line, al achilas maror. Umetabel maror b'charoses v'ochel. This is entirely familiar. We then make the bracha of al achilas maror. We dip the maror in the charoses, and we eat it. He adds, don't leave it in too long. Don't leave it in the charoses for too long. You need to taste the bitterness of the maror. He adds, and this mitzvah of maror nowadays is a mitzvah midrabanan, as we discussed. And then the Rambam describes korech. Final line of source number 7 in bold. The chozer v'korech matzah umaror. And then you put together the matzah and the maror. You dip it in the charoses, you eat it below bracha without reciting a bracha on it. And the Rambam concludes with just 2 words. Not 3 words, just 2 words. Seicher lemigdash. When you hear those 2 words in the context of the Seder, you almost intuitively, reflexively add the final word in the phrase, the word that we know should be there, the word that appears in the Gemara, the word that appears in our HaGadol. Seicher lemigdash kehillel. But the Rambam scrubs Hillel from the record. His psak in this final halacha does accord with the conclusion of the Gemara. And this is what the Lechem Mishnah was referencing in source number 6. The psak, if you just saw this halacha in the Rambam, you would get the impression that there is ambiguity as to who we paskin like. We are machmir for both shitos. We are concerned that each one may be correct. And so we eat matzah independently, and then maror independently, and then we eat the 2 of them together. And further, the Rambam eliminates Hillel from the story. Hillel, who we said at the outset is the hero of our story, the person we most associate with korech, is not given any credit in Perek Ches of the Rambam's Chametz U'Matzah. And if you read the Rambam's account, you wouldn't know that Hillel plays a role in the story at all. So when you look in the Rambam in these 2 halachos and consider them together, when you juxtapose them to one another, we wonder, what is the Rambam's perspective on korech? Is he pasking like Hillel? Is he elevating his opinion more than the Gemara did? Or is he eliminating Hillel from the story and removing him entirely. Now, in order to understand the Rambam's approach on Korech, I think we need to take a closer look at the logic behind Hillel's position, and Hillel's legal reasoning, and his halachic reasoning. If you recall, the Gemara said the logic behind Hillel's approach was a principle called mitzvos mevatlos suesu. When you have two mitzvos that are on the same level of halachic obligation, de'oraisa and de'oraisa, or alternately derabanan and derabanan, they do not cancel each other out. And so Hillel tells us, in the times of the Mikdash, you have matzah, you have maror, you have two separate mitzvos. You do them at the same time, but they don't cancel each other. You can fulfill both mitzvos through one single maisa, through one single halachic act. By eating matzah and maror together, you fulfilled two separate mitzvos simultaneously. What does the Rambam maintain in terms of that halachic reasoning? In order to assess it, we have to take a look at another Gemara that I alluded to earlier. It appears again 5 blot after the Gemara that we examined in source number 3. It's a Gemara in Pesachim Daf Kuf Chaf Amud Aleph, and it appears in source number 8. Amar Rabbi. Rabbi declares, Matzah bizman hazeh de'oraisa, umaror derabanan. Matzah nowadays in a post-Churban world, matzah is midoraisa, is a biblical obligation. Maror derabanan. Maror is only a rabbinic obligation. Asks the Gemara in bold of source number 8, Umayshna Maror, why is it that Maror was relegated to the level of derabanan? What did Maror do to deserve this demotion? The Gemara provides a source text. T'chsev al matzos umerorim. Our very same pasuk, Bamidbar Parak Tes pasuk Yud Aleph. The pasuk says that the carbon pesach should be eaten with matzah and maror. Bizman deika pesach yesh maror. Bizman de leka pesach leka maror. When you have a carbon pesach, then maror is a biblical obligation. Once you no longer have a carbon pesach, maror is no longer a biblical obligation. The Gemara follows this up with a very obvious follow-up question. The Gemara asks, Matzah nami, haksiv al matzos umerorim. If you're saying that about maror, the pasuk says the same thing about matzah, al matzos umerorim. So the same hermeneutical derivation that led you to say that maror is only midrabanan should lead to the same conclusion in the context of matzah. Use the same drush to say that matzah was only mita oraisa in the times of the carbon pesach, but is no longer mita oraisa. The Gemara concludes, Matzah mihadar hadar bekra ba'erev tofu matzos. When it comes to matzah, we have a separate pasuk that tells us, ba'erev tofu matzos, on the night of the 15th of Nisan, you shall eat matzah. There it is unqualified. It is not connected to any other obligation. It's not connected to carbon pesach. It's not connected to maror. It is a freestanding charge to eat matzah on the night of the 15th. So the Gemara concludes, matzah is now and for perpetuity a mitzvah mita oraisa. But maror is intrinsically linked to the carbon pesach. Now there are two ways to understand this Gemara, a chakira, if you will, and how to properly understand this Gemara. The first approach, which I think is the more intuitive approach, and really the approach that we have implicitly been assuming throughout our learning together this evening, is that maror was indeed once a mitzvah mita oraisa, and it had a fall from grace after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, and now it is only midrabanan. It is a mitzvah de oraisa that it hinges upon, that is linked to another mitzvah mita oraisa, namely the mitzvah of carbon pesach. And once we no longer have carbon pesach, maror was relegated to the level of derabanan. And this is the understanding that appears to emerge from a number of Rishonim. If you look in sources number 9 and 10, you will see the Sefer Yereim's treatment of matzah and maror. The Sefer Yereim was composed by Rabbi Elazar Mimetz, one of our Chachmei Ashkenaz. It's one of the many accounts or numerations of the 613 mitzvos. And the Yereim tells us in mitzvah tzadi aleph, the 91st mitzvah, it is achilas matzah, eating matzah. And in source number 10, the 94th mitzvah, siman tzadi daled, achilas marorim, there's a mitzvah to eat maror as well. In the paragraph, in source number 10, he describes that maror was once mita oraisa, now it is mita rabbanan. You have one mitzvah of achilas matzah and a separate mitzvah of achilas maror. The same applies to the Sefer Mitzvos Katan. If you look in sources 11 and 12. Sefer Mitzvos Katan is the Rimi Korvil, another of our Chachmei Ashkenaz, and here he lists them as two consecutive mitzvos. Siman Reish Tes, mitzvah 219, is le'echol matzah, b'leil tesvav b'Nisan, to eat matzah on the night of the 15th of Nisan. Mitzvah Reish Chaf, mitzvah 220, le'echol maror, b'leil tesvav b'Nisan, to eat maror on the 15th of Nisan. And once again, He goes on to elaborate that this mitzvah of Maror was once midoraisa, and now it is only midorabanan. That is one understanding of the Gemara. Two separate mitzvos. Matzah is always midoraisa. Maror was midoraisa and is now midorabanan. But the Rambam clearly does not understand the Gemara this way. If you look through the Rambam's Sefer HaMitzvos, the Rambam's count of the 613 mitzvos, and you try to find the mitzvah of achilas matzah, eating matzah, you will find it. It appears in source number 13. Mitzvah Sasei Kut Ches, the 158th mitzvah. Hishat Zivanu Le'echol Matzah, it is the command to eat matzah. But if you search the Rambam Sefer HaMitzvos, all 613, for the mitzvah of achilas maror, you will come up empty-handed. You will not find the mitzvah of maror counted by the Rambam. He does not include it in the 613 mitzvahs. Where does the Rambam mention maror in the Sefer HaMitzvos? In mitzvah Nun Vav, source number 14. Mitzvah Nun Vav, the 56th mitzvah saseh. Hishet zivanu le'echol keves ha'pesach le'el chamisha asar b'Nisan. It is a command to eat the carbon pesach on the 15th of Nisan. Bitnav haniskarim, with all the proper rules of how one is supposed to eat the carbon pesach. How is one supposed to eat the carbon pesach? The Rambam continues. It should be roasted, which is why we now have a minhag to not eat roasted meat on the night of the Seder, because we no longer have a carbon pesach. It should be consumed in one home. It shouldn't be eaten on the go as you're going from one house to the next. Stay in one place. And then, bold, second line, source 14. Im matzah umaror. It should be eaten together with matzah and maror. Who amro yisparach, and indeed the Torah tells us, eat the carbon pesach together with matzah and maror. On the third line, the Rambam anticipates the question that all of us ask when we learn the Gemara Psachim Daf Kuf Chaf, when we learn the Urei, and when we learn the Sefer Mitzvos Katan. Third line of source 14. Maybe someone will ask me, will challenge me. Why have you encountered all three of them as a single mitzvah? Count them as three separate obligations. Make each one its own distinct mitzvah in the count of 613. Says the Rambam Ashivenu, here is what I would respond. Even though it is true that matzah is its own mitzvah, as I explained in Mitzvah Kufnan Ches, what we saw in source 13. It is also true that eating the carbon pesach constitutes its own mitzvah, as he writes in Asay Nun Vav, the 56th mitzvah, Asay source 14. Bold at the end of source number 14. The maror, it is just a component of eating the carbon pesach. It cannot be counted as its own mitzvah. The Rambam says, if you just ate maror in the times of the Beis HaMikdash and you didn't eat a carbon pesach with it, you have achieved nothing. It is not its own mitzvah. We would not say that you've already fulfilled the mitzvah of achilas maror. The Rambam says, when you looked at the Gemara Psachim Daf Kuf Chaf, and it tells us that maror was once midoraisa and is no longer, it's not telling us that maror was this mitzvah that had two tiers, that once had a mitzvah that was deoraisa and now is only rabbinic. The Rambam understands the Gemara as communicating that maror was never its own mitzvah at all. It was always just a component of the achilas ha-pesach, of the mitzvah of the carbon pesach. And nowadays, in the absence of that carbon pesach, now we have a mitzvah midrabanan to consume maror in its place. If you want a hashkafic articulation of this principle, it appears in the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, source number 15, who says that maror was never intended as its own flavor, as its own taste. He says in bold of source number 14, the purpose of maror is because sometimes when you have roasted meat, you want something with a little kick to it on the side, or we would call it davar charif. You want something spicy on the side that's going to add to the palate, it's going to add to the flavor, it's going to enhance the eating experience. That's why you have maror together with the carbon pesach. It's never intended to be a taste in its own right. It was always intended to be combined with matzah and perhaps with carbon pesach. And so we return to Hillel. Hillel said you should eat matzah and maror together. But why should you do so? Because ein mitzvos mevad lo zu zu. Because we have these two mitzvahs. We have a mitzvah of matzah. We have a mitzvah of maror. And says Hillel, we are able to do both of those mitzvahs at the same time. They don't nullify each other. And in light of the pasuk in Bamidbar, Parates pasuk Yud Aleph, I say eat both of them at the same time. Fulfill both mitzvahs at once, simultaneously. And the Rambam looks at Hillel and says, I reject the entire premise. Yes, it's true. We should eat matzah and maror together. It may even be true that ein mitzvos mevad lo zu zu. It may be true that mitzvos don't cancel each other. The Rambam doesn't indeed paskin that way in Hilchos Psulei HaMikdashim. But the Rambam says, Hillel, you're looking at matzah and maror as two separate mitzvos that you perform simultaneously. And that's not my understanding of maror at all. The Rambam says we do in practice follow Hillel. We do in the times of the Mikdash, we would eat matzah and maror together. But as we would say in halacha, lav mi taimei, not because of the same legal reasoning or justification as Hillel. On the surface, the Rambam looks like he's holding like Hillel. But right underneath the surface, the Rambam is protesting adamantly. He is saying we eat matzah and maror together because they are a single taste, a single amalgamation of different flavors, a single symbolic experience that needs to be synthesized, that needs to be unified, that needs to be whole. And so when the Rambam tells us in our Seder that we still make that sandwich to remember the times of the Beis HaMikdash, he says, Zecher LeMikdash, but not Zecher LeMikdash Hillel, because the sandwich that the Rambam has us eating is not identical to the sandwich that Hillel ate. It is one of a single unified flavor, not two distinct flavors, not two distinct mitzvahs that are being achieved simultaneously and at once. Now, if this approach to the Rambam is correct, and the Rambam is telling us that matzah and maror, and all that they symbolically represent, shibud and geula, servitude, slavery, bitterness on the one hand, and redemption, freedom, aspirations on the other, they are not two separate experiences, because life often doesn't work that way. It's not neatly organized and punctuated with days of joy and other days of sadness, but with everything in its separate silo, everything in its separate file, everything completely and neatly organized in that fashion. The Rambam tells us in life, there are moments when we have matzah and maror together, and we need to be capable of experiencing both together at the same moment. As I was preparing for this Drasha, I was speaking to a number of different rabbis before Shabbat HaGadol. We talk about our Shabbat HaGadol Drashas, we trade sources. And one of the sources that I was pointed to was source number 16. Rabbi Rothwax shared with me that his sister, Malki Shik, who's a remarkably articulate writer, as you'll see in a moment, and who also had a battle with breast cancer, wrote an open journal chronicling that battle, chronicling that fight that she had with illness. Baruch Hashem, now she's doing much better. She's in full remission. But I was very taken by a post in her open journal entitled Flexibility, Mind, Body, and Soul. Source number 16. She begins with a quote from a Wikipedia article, a Wikipedia definition of cognitive flexibility. Cognitive flexibility has been described as the mental ability to switch between thinking about two different concepts and to think about multiple concepts simultaneously. She offers a personal reflection. I was saying Moda Ani, the morning prayer, thanking God for the restoration of my soul when I awakened, while contemplating if I would want to write something to be read at my funeral. She was thanking Hashem for restoring her soul, and at the same moment, contemplating what she would want to say, what she would want said at the moment that her soul was permanently restored to Avinu Shebashamayim, to our Father in heaven. She quips, never discuss these things with your spouse at 5:45 a.m. He said he thought a celebration of life and writing my own eulogy was a great idea. I will confess openly that when people discuss things with me when I am sleepy and tired, I would probably have a similar response. It's a great idea. But he came to his senses later. Then when he was awake enough, he realized that perhaps encouraging me to write my own eulogy in the wee hours of the morning was not the best idea. He came to his senses. She continues, it was actually a glorious morning. I can hold these concepts in my mind simultaneously. My will to live, the glorious morning, and the planning for my eventual passing. I actually enjoy doing that. I think it scares some people. They wonder if I am okay. But she insists I am fine. I enjoy doing this. It is the act of accepting all the different thoughts present at once and engaging them. It is the act of al matzos umerorim yochluhum. She continues to talk about emotional flexibility. Emotional flexibility is the capacity to produce context-dependent emotional responses to positive and negative life events. And she ponders, context-dependent emotional responses to positive and negative events. Well, suppose the same life event, breast cancer, has both positive and negative aspects. I can clearly recall the day in 9th grade when Rabbi Joseph Oratz was teaching our Torah Shabbat Peh class. We were learning selections of Mishnah Brachos and reading. Chayav Adam levarech al hara'a kashem shehu mevarech al hatova. A person is obligated to bless on the bad just as he is obligated to bless on the good. I stood for a while debating with the rabbi. I enjoyed his class. I found the logic engaging and the lessons meaningful. This made no sense. My teacher, who was also the school guidance counselor, was telling me that it was possible to feel both good and bad in the same moment. It took me quite a few years to understand that lesson, how naive I was. I will never forget where I learned it first. It is true. The Torah tells us that we can feel both good and bad in the same moment. The Torah validates it, the Torah licenses it. But not only does the Torah validate and license it, at times, the Torah demands it as well. The Torah demands that we be capable of holding within ourselves complex mixtures of emotions that can't be uniformly filed as good or bad as just one or the other. In our most joyous moments, we need to find some room within ourselves to hold some pain, because we live in an unredeemed and imperfect world, and pain is still out there. And as long as it's out there, we need to feel it too. Perhaps the most conspicuous expression of this finds its sources in 17 and 18, a pasuk in Sefer Tehillim and a Gemara in Maseches Brachos. The pasuk in Tehillim, Parak Beis, pasuk Yud Aleph tells us, "Ivdu es Hashem b'yira." David HaMelech says, "Serve Hashem with fear." It was that same David HaMelech who told us, "Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha," that we should also serve Hashem with joy. This pasuk didn't make it into a diaspora yeshiva band song, but it is true as well. And the Rambam happens to maintain that yira and avas Hashem, fear and love of God, like Matzah and Maror, are not two distinct and conflicting feelings, but actually come together. They are two sides of a single experience. But for our purposes tonight, our interest is really in the final two words of the pasuk. V'gilu b'ra'ada, rejoice with trembling. Says the Gemara in Brachos, source number 18. My v'gilu b'ra'ada. What does it mean to rejoice with trembling? Amar Rav Ada bar Masna Amar Rabba b'makom gila sham tehei ra'ada. Rav Ada bar Masna reports in the name of Rabba, in the place of rejoicing, in that very place, in that very moment, you should experience trembling. And the Gemara quotes a story, really a series of stories, to reflect the point. Mar berei de Ravina avad hilula leberei. Mar, the son of Ravina, made a wedding for his son. Chazinu l'rabbanan dehavu kabat kituva. And he saw that some of the rabbis present at the wedding were just getting carried away. Yes, the wedding is a joyous time, but when that joy becomes excessive, when it compromises one's dignified composure and conduct, it needs to be qualified. It needs to be regaled. It needs to be drawn back. I see casa demokra bas arba meazuzi. So what did he do? He took an expensive cup of 400 zuz, v'tavar kamayhu, v'atzivu. And he smashed it before them. And he succeeded in dampening the mood. It was an expensive lesson. The cup was 400 zuz. He could have bought himself a flock of 200 goats for that single goblet. But it was a lesson that was important to him, to make sure that there was proper emotional equilibrium, that everything was being held in its proper place, in its proper measure, that they weren't getting carried away with their joy. And Tosfos in source number 19 in bold tell us, this is the source of smashing a glass at a wedding. There are different interpretations of this minhag, of this Gemara in Brachos, but the Meiri provides the one that is perhaps the most widely celebrated, the most widely known. In source number 20, the Meiri tells us in bold, Remez l'davar im lo ala es Yerushalayim al rosh simchasi. The pasuk in Tehillim tells us that we elevate Yerushalayim over our greatest joy. And so the Meiri says, on the day of our greatest joy, when we recognize that the world is still incomplete, that Yerushalayim still lies in desolation and ruin, we still make sure that we find place to hold that pain within ourselves. And we don't only do that at a wedding, we do it on the night of the Seder too. In source number 21, the Ramah tells us, Nohagim b'ksas mekomos lechol b'seuda beitzim. Some places have the custom to eat eggs on the night of the Seder. Why? Zecher la'avelos, he says. Because an egg is a sign of mourning. Why do we keep a sign of mourning on our Seder plate? Why do we have it at our Seder table? He explains, it appears to me the reason for this is Mishum Shalel Tisha B'Av Nikva B'Leil Pesach. Because Tisha B'Av always falls out on the same night as Pesach. Calendrically speaking, it always falls out on the same night of the week. We'll see that in a moment. It reminds us of the fact that our Seder is incomplete, because at one point, the centerpiece of our Seder should have been the Karban Pesach. We no longer have it, and for that we mourn. In source number 22, the Shulchan Aruch and Orach Chaim Siman Taf Taf Ches, Shulchan Aruch offers that calendrical observation that the Rabbi was referencing in source number 21. He says there's a siman, there's a way to remember what day of the week different dates in the Jewish calendar fall out. Atbashi gives a whole siman for how to do so. The important line for us is what's in bold of source number 22. Heirosh, b'yom rishon shel Pesach, yiyeh le'olam Tisha B'Av. The first night of Pesach will always be on the same night of the week as Tisha B'Av. This year, if you're pondering what night we're going to read Eicha, what night we're going to begin the recitation of Kinos, it will be a Monday night, because that is the night of the first Leil HaSeder. And the Shulchan Aruch continues, V'simon, how do you remember this? Al matzos u'merorim yochluhu. Our pasuk, which indicates that matzah and maror should be eaten together, also reminds us that Pesach, our night of redemption, and Tisha B'Av, the night of Churban, the night of destruction, they always fall on the same night of the week. Those two nights are connected. And that ability to rejoice while simultaneously making space for pain has been particularly acute over the course of these past 6 months. Source number 23 is a prayer, a tefillah, that was written for Purim of this year, Purim Tafshin Pei Daled, by Rabbanit Esti Rosenberg. Rabbanit Esti Rosenberg is the head of the Midrasha at Migdal Oz. It's the institution for higher women's learning. It's a sister institution to my yeshiva, Yeshivat Har Etzion, to the Gush. And in trying to articulate the feelings that so many of us were having going into the joy and festivity of Purim, she composed this tefillah. Now, I'll reflect parenthetically that, and I can attest to this personally, Purim in Gush Etzion is a festive and raucous time, at least relatively. It is still a group of Gush guys that are trying to celebrate Purim, but relatively compared to the day before and the day after, it is a raucous and festive time. I will share that one of my, not fondest memories, but one of my most interesting memories of Purim in yeshiva involved Rabbanit Esti Rosenberg's sister-in-law. Her brother, Rav Moshe Lichtenstein Shlita, who was the current Rosh Yeshiva, one of the current Rosh Yeshiva of Har Etzion, was my Rebbe at the time when I was studying in the Gush, and around Purim time he was my Rebbe, and he invited all of the Talmidim, all of his students, to join him for a pre-Seuda get-together. So we all got together in his house. So you have this room that was filled with Bachrei HaYeshiva, with lots of boys from the yeshiva, and in the corner there was one young woman wearing a techel just sitting there among all of these young men, and everybody just assumed that it was likely just the wife of one of the older Bachrim, of one of the older boys, who had joined the celebration and was sitting in the corner. So Rabbanit Michal, Rav Moshe's wife, joined the festivities, and she saw this room filled with young men and this one poor young woman in the corner. So she goes right over to her. She wraps her up in this really big, tight hug, and she wishes her a Chag Purim Sameach. And as she's holding her in this embrace, she realizes that the young woman is actually my chavrusa, dressed up as a female. It was a very awkward moment for all of us. And I'm pretty sure he never used that costume again. But that was one moment that I recall from my time in the Gush. Another real moment that I recall, and I've shared this with from the pulpit in Bnei Yeshurun, was a moment in which Rabbi Mital addressed the Talmidim. He addressed the boys in the yeshiva. Rabbi Mital was the founding Rosh Yeshiva of Har Etzion, and the year I studied there was his final year as Rosh Yeshiva. He was already older. It was very difficult for him to get to yeshiva, but he came for Purim, and he got up and he posed a question on Purim night. He said, "Why is it that on Purim, this joyous occasion when we read Megillat Esther, we have some of the psukim, some of the verses are read in the tune of Megillat Eicha, in the sad, mournful tune of Megillat Eicha?" And all of us are sitting there, we're stroking our beards, or our scrappy excuses for beards at the time. And Rav Amital smiled and he quipped, he offered a joke. He said, "You want to know why we read some of the psukim in the tune of Eicha. He said, "Kadesha gam halitvakim yismechu b'chag Purim." We want the Litvaks also to be happy on the holiday of Purim. So we throw them a bone. We read a few psukim in the tune of Eicha. And as a good Litvak, I appreciated the joke at the time. But I will also say that this year, those psukim that we read in the tune of Eicha, Asher hogla mi Yerushalayim, v'chelim mikelim shonim, v'chasher avadti avadti, they didn't seem dissonant at all. They seemed quite appropriate, even necessary for a Purim celebration. And that's precisely what Rabbanit S.D. Rosenberg gave voice to in this beautiful tefillah she composed in source number 23. Leaning into the Tikkunei Zohar's equation between Purim and Yom Kippurim, Purim and Yom Kippur, she wrote, Al da'as hamakom li al da'as hakahal, with permission from Hashem above, with permission from the Kihila, from the congregation below. Anu matirin l'smoach, we request license, we request permission to rejoice. Matirin the Purim lihot ben l'nchoach, we request permission to actually experience the Purim, to be present for it. Li'kanes b'she'arim la'anot l'doda tofek, to enter inside the gates, to answer the beloved who knocks. All of those who have been injured and held captive, all of those who have fallen, all of those who have been targeted in acts of terror, all the soldiers serving from last Purim to this Purim, they stand before me. And I beg of them. Please just give me permission to celebrate this Purim, to rejoice, to enjoy. And just like the tefillos for permission to pray, as we recite at the beginning of Yom Kippur, she writes, in this moment, I request permission as well. Permission to rejoice, perhaps even permission to laugh. Mordechai to not know the difference between Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai. Reshut lehodot belev shavur, permission, license to offer gratitude with my broken heart. Reshut lavo lefnechi say hamelach b'vosh sak ba'efer v'letzok aka gedola umara. Even as I rejoice, even as I laugh, I seek license to appear before the king of all kings, wearing the clothes of mourning that Mordechai once more, and crying out bitterly before him. The Shmoa et Odelia, a reference to a popular Israeli singer, and to purify and cleanse my heart. To me, the most meaningful paragraph was the penultimate one, the second to bottom paragraph, where she writes, she scripts a response in the spirit of the Hataras Nadarim that we do before Rosh Hashanah. Hakol mutaran lach, hakol sharirin lach. All is permitted to you. Ein kan lo shikcha v'lo isur. We recognize that you have not forgotten. You have not forgotten the pain all around you, and therefore nothing is prohibited. Kashem she'anaknu matirin beveitin shamada kach matirin beveitin shamala. Just as we issue you this license in this earthly court below, they should issue this license in the heavenly court above as well. And then finally, Hareini Moseret Moda'a Lefnechem, she declares, let me hereby declare before you, Shekol Rikudenu, all of our dancing, all of our joy, all of our festivity, all of our celebration, Yulatova, Litfilah, Lizaka, Lega'aguag, Legiloi Shchina, Liyeshua Lo Nechama, La'am Yisrael, Legulat Yisrael, all of it. It's not because we've forgotten all of the pain that's going on around us. It's not because we've artificially placed it on the side, or we've temporarily forgotten that it's transpiring at all. All of it is to serve as a prayer, as a cry to you, Hashem, as yearning for the revealing of your Shekhinah, of your presence, for redemption, for the redemption of Am Yisrael. And that line, Ein kan lo shekcha v'lo isur, to me is so powerful. Yes, we need to find opportunities to celebrate. Yes, there's Purim and there will be a Pesach. But the matir, if you will, what gives us the license, what gives us the permission to rejoice, is the fact that we simultaneously find space for the pain, that we declare publicly that we haven't forgotten, that we will not forget, we'll never forget, and we will celebrate nonetheless, not as something distinct and separate from the pain that we feel, but as part of that experience, as a tefillah, za'aka, ga'agua legiloi shchina, as a hope and aspiration for a redemption to come. And if it's true that in our most joyous moments, we need to find space for pain, then kal v'chomer ben benoshel kal v'chomer, then all the more so it is true. Then in our moments of deepest pain, we must find space for hope, for optimism, even for joy. Perhaps the most tragic psukim in the entire Torah are the words that appear in source number 24 that we read in Parshas Shemini not so long ago. In those words, the death of Nadav and Avihu is described. It is the day of the inauguration of the Mishkan, a day that by all accounts should be one of the most joyous days in the entire history of Am Yisrael. But instead, tragically, Nadav and Avihu, the two sons of Aaron, are struck down. And I say that as perhaps, certainly among the most tragic psukim in the Torah, because as far as I can tell, it is the only instance in the Torah when we encounter a parent facing the death of a child. In Bereshis, we have a passing reference to Haran passing away, al panei terach aviv be'eretz moladto urkastim, but we don't really encounter it in a direct and raw way. This is the only instance where we have a parent witnessing the passing of his children. And we know that Aaron HaKohen responds with the two final words of source number 24, Vayidom Aaron. He responds with this mystifying silence. There are many, many approaches to what this silence indicates, what it was all about. I've offered many of them in shul. But I recently heard an approach, also in B'nai Yeshurun, from Rabbi Stuart Weiss, who recently spoke in our shul, again, roughly a month ago. At the time I introduced Rabbi Weiss, I shared the story of how Rabbi Weiss and I met. I actually met him on the holiday of Pesach. As a child, I always spent Pesach at home. Every single year we spent Pesach in our home. But as we got older, as I and my brothers got older, we got married, it gets more and more challenging to get everybody together on Yontif at the same time. And my mother wanted to find motivation for us to do so. So she recommended that perhaps we'll go away for Pesach, we'll go on a Pesach program. And she initially suggested that perhaps we should go to Greece for Pesach. Now, Greece is wonderful. I know that many of our members, or some of our members at least, will be in Greece for Pesach. Some of them may even be in Greece and watching right now. I have no doubt that it's beautiful and that it's wonderful and romantic and it should be a wonderful Pesach. But I was a homebody and I was not interested in going to Greece for Pesach. I wanted to stay home. And I was also a little bit of a mechutzif. I had a little bit of chutzpah. So when my mother said, let's go to Greece for Pesach, I responded, Mommy, why don't we just go to Greece for Hanukkah? And you can make a whole world tour out of it. You could go to Greece for Hanukkah, and you could go to Egypt for Pesach, Purim in Iran. There's a lot to do there. That was my response. Mommy, if you're watching, I apologize publicly for my chutzpah. I apologize, and I hope you can forgive me. But the truth was we didn't end up going to Greece, but my mother wisely recognized that there was another offer, another ace in the hole that she had. She said, why don't we go to Eretz Yisrael? And I responded, you don't have to ask me twice, a trip to Eretz Yisrael ever, and particularly on Pesach, Aliyah L'Regel. So we spent that Pesach in Eretz Yisrael. We spent it in the north, right along the Kinneret, my favorite part of the country, to me, the most beautiful part of the country, the most beautiful places in the world. And we had a beautiful Pesach there. Rabbi Weiss was the scholar in residence. Rabbi Weiss was a Rav in America for many years. He made Aliyah. And every year at Yizkar, he would share thoughts about his son, Ari. Hashem Yinkom Domav, Secher Tzadik B'Kadosh L'Dracha. His son Ari fell in uniform. He fell while serving in Tzahal, defending Am Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, and Medinat Yisrael. Rabbi Weiss recently in our shul offered a new approach to Vayidom Aharon, one that I was so taken by that I told him, I said, can you please share it with me in writing? And he did. It appears in source number 25. Popular belief is that Aharon's paralysis was due to his being in shock at the loss of his sons. But Rav Moshe Feinstein offers a striking explanation that resonates strongly within me. Says Rav Moshe, Aharon was struck at the very same moment by two polar opposite emotions. On the one hand, he was terribly grieved and saddened to see his oldest sons die, as any father would be. At the same time, he was shown a prophetic vision of Nadav and Avihu arriving in heaven to an unparalleled welcome by the angels who exuberantly greeted them and lavished praise upon them, heralding them as among God's greatest creations of all time. They would be taken to the highest level of heaven, opposite God's throne of glory. Continues Rabbi Weiss quoting Rav Moshe Feinstein. And so Aaron was caught, pulled between these two supremely conflicting emotions, tormenting sadness and rapturous joy. And to use a phrase, he literally did not know whether to laugh or to cry. And so he did neither. He remained silent, immobile, frozen by both the grief and the glory that simultaneously overwhelmed him. Continues Rabbi Weiss, and so it is with Ari's death. On the one hand, it is terrible beyond all words to lose a child, especially one as beautiful inside and out as Ari. His loss sent the world crashing down upon us, brought the darkening of the light, and epitomized the helplessness of the human condition. But at the very same time, Ari died at the very highest point in his life, a modern Rabbi Akiva, who gave his very soul of the whole nafshecha for his nation, his people, and Hashem. Could there be a more noble way to end a life? How can we not feel immense pride in our son when an entire country salutes him? And so we, as well as all the too many bereaved families that have lost soldier sons and daughters in combat, are torn and transfixed. Each of us, in essence, is a Vayidom Aharon. I will quite openly confess that in my limited emotional range, my limited emotional lexicon and vocabulary, I cannot truly understand how a parent who has lost a child, to me, again, certainly among, if not the single, most tragic experience one can go through in life, can describe that experience as entailing elements of, quote, rapturous joy, end quote. It's something that I can't fully understand, but I can tell you, Aaron HaKohen understood it. And the many modern-day Aaron HaKohens, as Rabbi Weiss articulated, too many modern-day Aaron HaKohens, they understand it too. In that darkest moment of their lives, they find a small window, a small opening for positivity, hope, even joy. And that too is something we seek to experience on the night of the Seder. Source number 26 quotes a famous Mishnah in the 10th parak of Maseches Pesachim that declares on the night of the Seder, we are maschel begenos u'mesayim b'sheva. The narrative trajectory of the Seder needs to start in a low point and end on a high point and end with praise. Ordinarily, that's interpreted as a study in contrasts. If you really want to understand just how great the redemption from Egypt was, if you want to understand its full splendor and grandeur and majesty, you must perforce understand the degradation and subjugation of Egypt and just how terrible it was. Only then can you appreciate the high points of the story, the Shevach that appears at the end. But Rav Kook in Alat Riyah in source number 27 doesn't understand it that way. He suggests that Maschel Begenos U'Masayim B'Shevach does not mean that we contrast them in order to highlight the highs. Rather, it means we juxtapose them in order to redeem the lows. We'll read just a few bolded words of source number 27, again in the interest of time. Rav Kook says, why do we have this arc of Maschel Begenos U'Masayim B'Shevach? L'horos shehagenos hitzorech hashevach, to show that those low points were a critical component. They were needed for the Shevach, for the praise that appears at the end of the Seder. Without those low moments, we never could have had a full cheros, a full freedom. We never could have appreciated the proper cheros and achieved the proper cheros that we have by the end of the Seder. Says Rav Kook, it was all part of the story. It was all part of the plan. And yes, it was extraordinarily difficult to see that when we were experiencing it initially. But now, thousands of years later, as we look back, we redeem those low moments as well. We recognize that they too had some positivity in them. They too were part of our story of redemption. And yes, it's true. In life, we have positive moments when we need to find space for pain. There are difficult, tragic moments when we need to find space for joy. But there are other moments when we're just asked to hold both in equal measure. Not joyous moments punctuated by pain, not painful moments punctuated by joy, but moments when genuinely we just need to hold both, all at the same time. And one of the leitmotifs, one of the themes of the Seder is that we have items with symbolic resonance that represent two things at the same time, often two opposite things at the same time. If you look at sources 28 and 29, you'll see a debate as to why we wear a kittel at the Seder. The Taz says it's reminiscent of burial shrouds, big day mason, like the Rabbanon at the wedding of Maror de Ravina. We don't want to get too carried away. We don't want to lose our emotional equilibrium. So we punctuate or we qualify the joy of the Seder with this reminder of Misa, with this reminder of death in order to maintain emotional equilibrium. It's a burial shroud. But the Netziv, in his introduction to his Akdama, in the introduction to his Agada, argues that it's not a burial shroud, it's aristocratic garb. We don the wardrobe of aristocracy on the night of the Seder. The Netziv says when you eat at the table of the king, you don't wear the same clothes, you don't wear the same t-shirt and sweatpants that you do when you're having pizza at home. So on the night of the Seder, you wear aristocratic garb, the kittel, to represent our royalty. I mentioned before that according to the Rambam, the egg that we have at the Seder is Zecher la'avelos. It's a commemoration of mourning. On Erev Shabbos, right before Shabbos, Rav Brzezinski pointed out to me, it's in his Sefer Road to Redemption, that according to Rav Leibel Eger, the egg is actually a sign of Geula. It's a sign of redemption. The egg is a sign of potential. It's an egg now, but one day it will hatch. One day it will grow. It will become something greater. It is simultaneously a symbol of mourning and a symbol of Geula. In sources number 31 and 32, the Gemara tells us that charoses is on the one hand symbolic of the cement that the Jews had to use to build during their subjugation, during their slavery in Egypt. And on the other hand, its ingredients, the apple inside it, is zecher letapuach. It reminds us of the apple orchards in which the Jewish woman would give birth, securing the future of Am Yisrael. The wine that we have on the night of the Seder, the Shulchan Aruch in source 33 tells us needs to be red wine. Why red? The Mishnah Berurah in source 34 gives us two different reasons. One, because red wine is considered the most chashuv wine. It is considered the most expensive and valuable wine. That's why you should use it as a symbol of cheiros, of luxury, of freedom. Make sure that you have red over white. And then the Mishnah Berurah says there's another reason why we have it as well. Zecher l'dam, shayaparo shochet b'nei Yisrael. It commemorates the Jewish blood that was slaughtered. The Jews were slaughtered by the Egyptians. It is simultaneously a sign of royalty, aristocracy, freedom. And it reminds us of our pain, our loss, our subjugation. And perhaps most poignantly, we have the lach ma'anya, the matzah itself. That is simultaneously lechem oni, it is a poor man's bread, and it is lechem she'onin alav dvarim harbe. It is the bread on which we declare the praises of Hashem. It is the bread of our affliction and the bread of our redemption. On the night of the Seder, whether it be through the kittel, or the eggs, or the charoses, or the wine, or the matzah, we are asked to hold both truths simultaneously. And for me, that's precisely what we've been asked to do these past 6 months. I remember in the days after October 7th, my mother told me that she has never felt so much pain and simultaneously never felt so much pride. I remember in those early days, I found myself crying so often that at a certain point, I lost track of whether the tears were tears of pain and anguish or tears of hope and inspiration. Every time I would open my phone, I didn't know what to expect. Would it be a video that would make me cry out of anguish or a video that would leave me inspired and leave me crying all the same? Was it going to be some horrific headline from the Western press or the latest news from college campuses? Or would it be some clip of Israeli dark humor that would leave me laughing in spite of myself? It was just hard to keep track. And the task was, and the task remains, to hold both truths at the same time. Those who have been listening to my drashos over the last 6 months will know that one of the stories that has been constantly on my mind and really closest to my heart is the story of the Peretz family. I spoke about them on Shabbos Bereshis, the very first Shabbos after October 7th. I spoke about them more recently after the funeral of their son, Daniel. And I assume most listeners are likely familiar with the story, but in case anyone is not, on October 7th, Rav Daron and Shelley Peretz, they had two sons who went into combat, into battle against the terrorists who were seeking to destroy our people. Their oldest son, Yonatan, fought the terrorists and was injured in combat. Fortunately, he only suffered light injuries. And their second son, Daniel, went out to combat the terrorists and was presumed to have been taken captive. We only recently learned that it's likely that he fell on October 7th, but he was presumed to have been taken captive. And a few weeks after October 7th, Yonatan, the oldest son, was scheduled to get married. And the Peretz family had to decide whether or not they were going forward with the wedding. They weren't initially entirely sure. They thought back and forth a little bit, but they decided they were going to go forward. And Rav Daron described what that experience was like for him standing under that chuppah. He actually described this in person to all of us who were together in Eretz Yisrael on the Bnei Yeshurun mission to Israel. He described this to us directly. Unfortunately, I didn't have any recording or transcript of those remarks that he gave then. So instead, I took from remarks that he made to Rabbi David Bashevkin in the 1840 podcast in an episode entitled Our Heart, One Child Married, One Child Missing. Source number 38. Rav Doron shared, I'll tell you that my coping mechanism was, I'm putting Daniel out of my mind for the chuppah and the wedding. It's the only way that I feel that I can be present for my son. The only way that he felt he could be present for Yonatan was to put Daniel out of his mind, silo it, to compartmentalize, to put it somewhere else. He continues, that came crashing down because the rabbi did what he should have done. The Masadr Kiddushin, he started speaking and he was very emotional. And he said, we cannot begin this wedding without acknowledging the one person who we all feel the lack of his presence, the one person who is missing. And at that moment, I broke down. I had tried so hard to avoid that thought. There was no game plan. Everything was happening quickly. And I and my wife, I don't know if there was a dry tear with anyone. My wife and I just couldn't hold it together. I was crying. I was sobbing. I had my son holding me on the one side. I had my mechutin on the other side. My son, the chassan, was holding me saying, Dad, it's okay. It's going to be okay. He was holding me and the mechutin was just holding me. We were all crying. And the rabbi then said, we are now going to say Shir Lama'alos. We're going to daven for Daniel. And we davened for him. And I'd say those 2-3 minutes for me have been the most painful in the last 5 weeks. A father not knowing the whereabouts of his son, worrying about where he might be, what's being done to him in Gaza. He says the 2 to 3 most difficult moments were the moments when he was standing under his son's chuppah. Those were the most difficult moments he experienced in those early days after October 7th. But somehow, they took that genos and turned it into Shevach. But you know what happened was, we wiped our faces. He changed the mood and we had a simcha. There was 1 or 2 other tears. Family pictures were hard. But I will tell you that somebody said to us, the chuppah, she said this was the holiest, saddest, happiest, most inspiring chuppah she's ever been to. And it was all of those things together. The pain was given its place. The loss was given its place. The angst was given its place. If I may add, the maror was given its place. And then the simcha took place. The matzah was there as well. But the Ron continues, he suggests that perhaps that is pshat. In the famous pasuk at the beginning of the 3rd parak of Kohelas, La kol zaman ve'es l'chol chayfetz tachas hashamayim. And everything has its proper time and its proper season. Rav Peretz again in source 40. For me, that has been certainly initially the most profound experience that you would have asked, if you would have asked me before this, how it's possible to take 2 such contradictory sentiments and feelings, and how can they coexist in a way without one totally overwhelming the other or causing confusion, I wouldn't have known. Or in other words, he would have said, yes, mitzvos mevatlos zu es zu. One must perforce, one must, by definition, cancel the other. You can't hold both of them at the same time. And the most profound feeling I had was like a mindset shift. When we read Perek Gimel, that we all know, I always thought that was different periods in your life. And Shlomo Melech said, you just got to know that in every season and every period, there's certain appropriate feelings. I realized for me that maybe the pshat is not that. The pshat of the most knowledgeable of all people, Shlomo Melech, the wisest, is to say you've got to know the wisdom of life is that all of these things often happen at the same time. The wisdom is which of these to give expression to and which of these to compartmentalize. And in a base avel, no matter what simcha you're in, whatever simcha you're experiencing personally, if you have to contain it and you have to be ba'avelos. And in a time of simcha, you've got to be able to take the angst and the difficulties and all of those things, and even sometimes death, and all of these things and put them in their place. And I felt, having been through this wedding, that it's possible. It's possible to go through this with the words, which sort of in my head were playing over. The 2 Hebrew words were charada and chadva, directly parallel to the words gilu birada that we saw in David HaMelech and Tehillim Barak Beis, that you can have such trembling, but at the same time, such happiness. And they're both present. We were able to put the charada in its place and have a simcha where the chadva was the overwhelming feeling. The moment of the Seder when we are most asked to hold on to both truths of life, of Jewish history, of Jewish experience, and somehow let the chedva triumph, somehow let the geula triumph, is the moment of korech. the moment when we have that sandwich of matzah and maror on the night of the Seder. The Tur in source number 41 in Orach Chaim Siman Tav Ayin Hey records a machlokas rishonim as to whether or not one should lean to the left when eating korech. Leaning is, of course, a sign of cherus, a sign of freedom. And accordingly, there's a machlokas as to what one should do. He quotes Rabbi Hillel, who says, you can't lean during korech. There's maror in that sandwich. Alternately, he quotes the Baal HaManig, who says, you should lean. There's matzah in the sandwich. What should one do? Fortunately, in this circumstance, we actually know how they paskin in the Masifta Derakia. We know how they paskin. The angels of the heavenly host, we know what they hold on this matter. Because in source number 42, in Magid Mesharim, the sefer that's widely attributed to Rav Yosef Karo, that's based on his discussions with a Malach Hashem Tzavakos, whatever that means. Rav Yosef Karo evidently had, the Mechaber of our Shulchan Aruch, the author of our Shulchan Aruch, had a machlokas with an angel of the heavenly host who told Rav Yosef Karo what they hold up there, what are their halachic positions on different issues. And he records, Lo mis'achale bahaseba, because there is maror in the korech, because it is a symbol of galus, of exile, you should not lean when you have matzah and maror, when you have that korech on the night of the Seder. But shockingly, even though that's how they paskin in the Beis Din Shalmala, here in the Beis Din Shalmata, we don't paskin that way. If you look in Shulchan Aruch or Chaim Siman Tav Ayin Hey, source number 43, the Shulchan Aruch says, "Ochlan b'yachad b'haseba." We eat our korech and we do lean. In Beis Yosef, in source number 44, he says, it's obvious to me, it's evident to me that we should lean while we're eating that sandwich. It just doesn't add up. You turn to Rav Yosef Karo, you say, you found out how they paskin in the Masifta Derakia, that's how they paskin upstairs, and then in the Shulchan Aruch that's guiding Klal Yisrael, you offer a different psak, you ignore what the Maggid told you. Is that really the Shulchan Aruch that we follow? Is that really our method of paskening halacha? What's pshat? I'll tell you what I think pshat is. A malach is very wise. A malach understands deep, mystical, and esoteric secrets. He comprehends spiritual matters, metaphysical matters that we do not understand and perhaps cannot understand. But you know what a malach can never understand? You know what he can never comprehend? A malach can never understand what it feels like to stand under the chuppah of one child while another child is presumed to be held captive in Gaza. A malach can never understand that combination of tormenting sadness and rapturous joy that the parent of a child who falls in uniform experiences in the aftermath of their passing. A malach can't understand what it's like to experience a Purim in the middle of the worst war since Medinat Yisrael's founding 75 years ago. He can't possibly comprehend that combination that we are asked to hold between pain and joy, between despair and hope, between tragedy and triumph. He doesn't get it. So he says, there's maror in the sandwich, there can't be a seba, you can't lean. It just doesn't add up, it doesn't work, it doesn't compute. And Rav Yosef Karo turns to his chavrusa and he says, "B'mechilas kvodcha," with all due respect, maybe that's how you paskin in the heavens above. But down here, we are going to lean. We're going to hold the matzah and the maror. We're going to experience all of it at the same time. And we will find a way for the cheros, for the freedom, for the geula, for the redemption. We will find a way for it to emerge. Last source on tonight's source sheet, source number 45, really breaks every rule of my usual source sheets on Shabbat HaGadol. I do not usually include any pictures. I do not usually include any WhatsApp groups, and I certainly never quote myself. But to close, I will share with you the moment that I decided that tonight we would be speaking about korech. It would be our topic for Shabbat HaGadol. And I know some of you saw this. This was a WhatsApp group that included updates from my first trip to Eretz Yisrael. I know many of you were following that trip. But I concluded that trip with a visit to the Kotel, Ma'aravi. I ended my trip with a stop at the Kotel on my way back to the airport. The Kotel is usually my first stop after arriving. But this time I was so caught up in everything else going on that I didn't make it until the end. And I will share with you personally, I did not write this in the WhatsApp group, but every time I go to the Kotel, in this instance I daven Mariv, and afterwards I always try to just go up to the wall, I put my hand on the stones, and I really just try to engage my Father in heaven in personal conversation. I always speak In English, I just engage Avinu Shebashamayim in personal conversation. And in this instance, after I finished davening Mariv, I went to the wall, and I had no words. I had no words to express. I don't possess the wisdom of Rabbi Doron Peretz or Rabbi Shmuel Weiss or Rabbi Nit Esti Rosenberg. I certainly don't have the wisdom of Hillel, the Chachamim, of Shlomo, of David. I had no words. I just cried. And in leaving and trying to capture that mixture of emotions, I wrote the following. I said, "Forgive me for getting a little NCSY." It's actually really like a lot NCSY, so just bear with me. But it says, "Forgive me for getting a little NCSY, but I have always found the image of the Kotel with the Israeli flag waving in front of it a powerful symbolic juxtaposition. A wall that symbolizes Khurban and all that we've lost, and a flag symbolizing renewal and all that we seek to regain. That mixture, pain and hope, sadness and inspiration, tragedy and triumph, all that's been destroyed and all that we seek to build, Maror and Matzah, resonated in a wholly different way after this trip. Let us always remember those we've lost and never forget the love and unity we've built through their sacrifice. May Hashem see to it that we speedily defeat those who seek to destroy us and deliver us a full redemption. B'mehera b'yameinu." I wish everyone a Chag Kosher B'Sameach, and in the spirit of the Korech, of all those mixed feelings that we will hold on the night of the Seder, may we indeed merit to see that full redemption speedily in our days. Shabbat Tov.